Coming up on today's episode of the All Aboard Podcast, we talk about Robert R. Young, rail innovation, and the future of the industry. Have your tickets out of the envelope. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast, and blessed to have a highly trained railroad audience. And as always, I hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees because the learning never ceases. And you know the deal. I'm back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So today's episode is going to be a little bit more freeform. What I wanted to do was just talk a little bit more about Robert R. Young. Now, in the last episode, we talked about him as part of the proxy fight that Norfolk Southern is currently facing against a company out of Ohio called Ancora Holdings. And we're talking about it because proxy fights, number one, are a lot of fun. But number two, because a lot of times they do have the ability to inject new blood, new ideas, and new approaches into existing industries. Now, to go back a little bit, railroads in the time of Robert R. Young, as today, are considered to be old industries. Now, that's not to say that they're stodgy. That's not to say they're terrible or anything like that. They've just been around for a long time. And when you have an industry that's been around for a long time, you have a variety of things. First of all, you have a lot of relationships that develop within that industry. And so you can see that when we talk about railroading. How many times have you seen someone like an E. Hunter Harrison or Jervis Langdon or the Doramus family where they were able to run multiple railroads? A lot of that happens because of the relationships that they have built up within the industry. It's even more widespread below the senior level because a lot of folks will develop friendships with each other, and this is where a lot of ideas get spread back and forth between the industries. Now, this is particularly acute for railroads because railroads have to work together by virtue of interchanging cars and passengers. That's one of the big reasons we have standard gauge, so that railroads can transfer cars to each other across the country. And even if the operating practices on CSX are not the same as they are in Norfolk Southern, they still have to be relatively similar because they are in the same line of work, doing the same thing with the same equipment, and of course, with the same people. Now, Young is rare because while he was a railroad outsider, he also innovated a lot with the rail operations themselves. Now, I want you to think about this. What we've heard a lot of from Ancora is predicated on precision scheduled railroading being the way that they would like to improve the returns and the operational capabilities of the NS. And we've talked about precision scheduled railroading, so please go back and watch the episode on that and share your comments because I really want to hear what you think, since that is a very hot topic. But a lot of what PSR is doing is not as much operational innovation as much as it is financial innovation. And I don't want you to take that in a negative way. Financial innovation is important because when you think about most of the problems, I should say, that many businesses tend to have, those come about because of the way the business is structured financially. In the case of railroads, this was something that was a big problem because earlier on, in the 19-teens, the 1920s, after you had USRA control and so on, you had financial structures developed that very much fit the times in which the railroads operated. However, what happened was the coming of air travel, the coming of paved highways, so that you had much more competition, whether you are a fan of the government's engagement in those industries or not. They were there, and so therefore they were competing with the railroads. That meant the way that railroads were financially structured, and that is everything from union contracts to employees, to the dividends that they have to pay on preferred stock, to even the bonds that they had outstanding. All of that meant something. And then so as you got to the 1950s and the 1960s, and you had, number one, declining passenger business, and number two, big declines in the freight business, which were, of course, being more diverted to trucking, that meant railroads could not continue to operate the way they had financially, even if a lot of the core abilities for many of the carriers were, in fact, very good. Young, though, came along and he said, well, you know what? I think we need to innovate operationally. And so he said, well, let's try a few new things. Now, one of the things that I talked about in the last episode, and I wanted to touch on a little bit more, was the Chessie. Now, the Chessie is best known as being a train that went absolutely nowhere. And here's a picture of the Chessie's steam turbine locomotive, which itself was innovative at the time. Not pulling the Chessie, but it's pulling what looks like to be a regular consist, maybe a secondary mainline passenger train, something like an accommodation train. The Chessie was innovative because it was pretty much incorporating some of the creature comforts that we take for granted today into its operation. First thing that that is so unique about the Chessie, and I'm surprised that even Young came up with this, was the 36-seat coach. Now, today, if you ride Amtrak in a more dense corridor setting, such as the Northeast Corridor Line, the Hiawatha, or some of its Illinois services, you'll be riding either Am coaches or Horizon fleets that are set up with roughly 80 people per car. When Amtrak operated the Metro liners before Acela Express, some of these same Am coaches, the Amfleet 1s, were fitted with 60 seats per car. I think it was between 60 and 65. It's actually 60 seats, if I recall correctly. That meant you had a little bit more room to spread out. Now, Young said, no, not 80, not 60, let's go with 36. So this was much more of taking the coach approach and combining it with the parlor car approach. Now, what do we value so much today? It is the ability to spread out, especially on air travel. But this was something that was unheard of at the time. Why? Because remember what makes railroads profitable, and that is the ability to aggregate demand. So the more people you can pack into the coach the same way, the more people you can pack into an airplane, the more profitable you're going to be, because that means you're going to use the same amount of power and the same crew in order to carry a larger number of people. But Young said, we've got to try something different. And I believe that was very innovative for its time and even today, because what do we place a big emphasis on now in 2024? It is the comfort, and it is the ability to cultivate our own personalized experiences. And while a 36-seat coach certainly isn't your own private car, it does much more lend itself to cultivating that travel experience, whether it's you by yourself or you with a travel companion aboard the train. Now, another thing that he did with the Chessie, and we've got a photo here if we can get it to come up. And this, by the way, is taken from streamlinermemories.com, which is run by Randall O'Toole. Randall O'Toole is a former fellow at the Cato Institute, and we will be doing his book, Romance of the Rails, tomorrow for our monthly book review, where he talks about passenger trains and says some things that aren't so nice, but you're going to want to hear. But if you look down there, you will see in the photo, and I'm sorry I can't make it bigger, but you see office equipment. You see a place for a stenographer. You see a typewriter. All of these were available aboard the Chessie for its passengers. And what does that have to do with innovation? Well, let's think about, what do we do today in 2024 when we're traveling? Well, we have these things. Got my my Microsoft tablet. This is all of those things that Young had, but in its day, they weren't as streamlined as they are now. But Young had the foresight to add these to the trains. Now, I know some of you will say, well, you had some of these services with the 20th Century Limited, the Broadway Limited, some of these higher profile passenger trains in the past. That's true, but this was an effort, especially being applied to a coach-only train, which was not going to be the primary way that many of the upper-class businessmen were traveling, because, of course, they were taking your Broadway Limiteds and 20th Century Limiteds, which at the time were still all Pullman, which means all sleeping cars. This was democratizing it and bringing it to the masses. Now, what do we value? For those of us who are not traveling in first class or are rarely traveling in first class, but we've still got a lot of work to do, we want that ability. Until something like this was invented where we could carry it on our own, having it being provided by the folks who operated the train was something new and very, very innovative. And so much before so much before the time when it would actually be widely used. Another thing that Young did, and I've got a photo here of a couple of really interesting characters. You see Young there on the right in the cab of Train X, and he is shaking hands with Al Pearlman, who he brought over from the Denver and Rio Grande Western to the New York Central after he took control. Finally, I should say, took control of the New York Central, since it took a couple of efforts in order for him to do that. That was a critical innovation that he was doing with the goal of bringing new trains on the market. Now, why do I talk about new trains? Well, there were so many problems that railroads were facing with respect to their passenger service, and I'm sorry I'm not looking directly at you, but here you go. I wanted to show you the front of that. That is New York Central's X train, the Explorer, as it was known, which had diesel hydraulic locomotives built by Baldwin Lima Hamilton and with diesel engines supplied by Maybach. And yes, that is the same Maybach that has its logo on the luxury sedan that appears in all the rap videos nowadays. Why was this innovative? Well, first of all, it was bringing the Talgo technology over and utilizing it on American passenger trains. And while many of the early Talgos, as we talked about a few episodes ago, were built here, they were actually built here and then shipped to Europe and not used here. But some element of the Talgo technology was incorporated into Train X with Young's leadership, and this eventually debuted on the New York Central, although a lot of the work had taken place while he was in charge of the Chesapeake and Ohio. This was the approach of saying, guess what? We're not going to be able to continue to do things the way that we have. And one of the things that we need to work on is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the number one buzzword that we hear about today. But back then, it was being done not because of some belief that the environment was going to go to hell, but because Young saw this as being a great way to make the railroad, number one, more profitable, but number two, bring people back. After all, for all the good things that a steam turbine and streamlined steam engines and the Budd-built passenger cars with the stainless steel fluting and so forth had, keep in mind, it did not capture the imagination the way this did, because this very much was in keeping with the Buck Rogers feeling of modernity that was going on in the 1950s by the time Young was taking control at the New York Central. Another thing that Young was very, very big on and has become, I guess you could say, the preeminent driving force of railroading for the past few decades was consolidation. Looking behind me at the thumbnail, you can see we've got a New York Central locomotive next to a Chesapeake and Ohio locomotive. As early as the 1940s, Young wanted to first coordinate the Chesapeake and Ohio and the New York Central because he believed the C&O with its strong coal traffic would have been a great way to support the New York Central, which had a primarily manufacturing-focused base. But then, as would happen later, the New York Central was very much prone, because of that manufacturing base, to a lot of financial ups and downs. Keep in mind, when the economy is much better, the New York Central will do better. When the economy goes down, the New York Central will go down. And of course, looking back in history, whether we're talking about the Great Depression or the times preceding it, and even some of the times after it in the Federal Reserve era, you have an economy that is prone to those cycles. But for something like a railroad, which has a lot of long-lived assets, which has, as we were speaking about earlier, a lot of bonded debt, a lot of loans and so forth that continue to have to be serviced, looking for a way that you can smooth out the impact of the business cycle on a railroad, particularly with that asset base, is very, very important. And so Young saw putting the C&O and the NYC together as solving that problem for the New York Central, but also increasing those returns for the Chesapeake and Ohio, because now they would be able to take advantage of the burgeoning industrial economy that you were seeing in states like Michigan, in New York, Pennsylvania, even New Jersey. So Young was ahead of his time in pushing consolidation, because at the time he was doing it, it had not yet been viewed as the best way to improve railroading. Now, consolidation, though, it really did break up, or at least it threatened a lot of the established order. And that was one of the biggest things that you can see Young doing and being way ahead of his time. If you look at some of the great literature that's out there, Merging Lines by Richard Saunders, which we reviewed a few weeks ago, is one. I encourage you to read that, and we'll link that in the description. The other is this book here, Robert R. Young, The Populist of Wall Street by Joseph Borkin, which is a great explanation of his life and the work that he did to take over the Chesapeake and Ohio, which, by the way, was no easy feat. Because just to give you a little bit of background, the Chesapeake and Ohio had been controlled by the Allegheny Corporation, which had been formed by the Van Sweringen brothers of Cleveland. Now, the problem was, though, because of the way Allegheny was structured, and it was largely a debt-funded enterprise, portions of the stock of the railroads that it owned were pledged for different issues. And that meant that banks and other participants, bank servicers and so forth, had an enormous say in how the stock was controlled and how those companies had to operate. And this is part of the reason why Allegheny, for all of its big reach and all of the revenues it generated. And let me tell you, the railroads it controlled, in addition to Chesapeake and Ohio, you had the Wheeling and Lake Erie, you had the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, the Missouri Pacific, the Pere Marquette, and the Nickel Plate Road. All of those railroads together, plus a substantial stake in the New York Central as well, that pretty much would have created, if it had been merged together, a system that went as far east as Boston, New York City, Newport News, Norfolk, and going all the way out to Colorado, Texas, even almost to the edge of New Mexico. Well, we shouldn't say that. We should say at least getting near the edge of New Mexico, as Missouri Pacific actually went pretty far west in Texas with its controlled subsidiaries there. That would have been an enormous system, not only for its day, but even for today. And that's considering the size of carriers like the Union Pacific, BNSF, and so on. That meant so many of the participants, your bankers and so forth, and we're talking about Morgan Stanley, Guaranty Trust, all of those big Lehman Brothers, Kuhn Loeb, all of those big names that you've heard had a stake in it. And guess who they didn't have a stake in? Was this guy from Texas who they hadn't heard of named Robert R. Young, who may have been kind of around the periphery in that he was working with some people they did know, Pierre DuPont, of General Motors fame and also DuPont fame. And by the way, Pierre DuPont, Pierre S., is the guy who was best known for the copper-cooled car fiasco at General Motors when GM attempted to switch from radiators that used water or coolant to radiators that simply used air. Innovative idea, didn't quite work due to the metallurgy at the time. They got together, DuPont, Jacob Raskob, who'd been GM's treasurer, and also Young got together and put together an investment group, of all places based at 230 Park Avenue, the New York Central building, now the Helmsley building. Aside from that, he wasn't exactly a Wall Street mainstay. But Young comes along, he puts an investment group together, he takes over Allegheny, but then because he doesn't have great relationships with a lot of the banking elite, including Thomas W. Lamont, who was the head of J.P. Morgan, and also, I believe it is the grandfather or great-grandfather of Ned Lamont, the politician from Connecticut. So that gives you an idea of how closely intertwined a lot of these circles were. Because of that, they attempted to take control of the Chesapeake and Ohio away from Allegheny and Young. And so he had to spend several years fighting them in order to get control of that carrier back. Then he tried to start this merging process by merging with the Nickel Plate Road. The Nickel Plate, which stretched from Buffalo to Chicago and St. Louis, was an important artery. The Van Sweringens, who built Allegheny, had come to control it when the New York Central had to let it go. But you had preferred stockholders who, again, fought Young, which is very interesting because Young has always painted himself as a champion of the small stockholder. Yet these preferred shareholders, in all likelihood, as part of relationships with larger, more elite financial syndicates, and I don't use the term elite in a negative way. I say that to differentiate them from your more retail investors, which were not as large at the time, fought him, and therefore he was never able to take control of the Nickel Plate. And I want you to think about the impact that small act had. As a result, the Nickel Plate ended up being independent. It built a close relationship with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, and eventually, as part of the Pennsylvania Railroad's effort to merge with the New York Central, it ended up merging with the Wabash and the Norfolk and Wheeling Lake Erie into the N&W and made the Norfolk and Western the large system that it became pre-Norfolk Southern. Now, were it not for that, what does the map look like? Well, it's really hard to say. A nickel plate that had joined with the Chesapeake and Ohio, with the potential inclusion of the Pere Marquette, which eventually happened anyway, could have set up a strong system in the east that looked very much like the N&W did, just, a few miles north in some cases in terms of where the lines were located. That may very well have resulted in mergers other than the C&O joining with the Southern Railroads, which became the Seaboard system, and that's the Seaboard Airline, Atlantic Coastline, the Seaboard Coastline, the Louisville and Nashville, and so on, because then the map looks dramatically different, and a lot of the mergers do not take place the way they do. In fact, you look at the Chicago and Eastern Illinois, which was part of the Allegheny system and operated more or less, the north had a substantial north-south operation from the Chicago area into Evansville, but also went out to St. Louis, big carrier in Illinois, generally unremarked though, because it was, for whatever reasons, fairly obscure. And that's why in our next season, we're going to do a very deep dive into the CNEI and the role that it plays in today's railroading as part of Union Pacific and CSX. Another possibility is that eventually the C&O could very well have merged with the Missouri Pacific and created something of a Atlantic to Gulf Railroad with a substantial presence in the Midwest and a lot of grain traffic. Had that taken place, the Union Pacific as we know it today and the Southern Pacific as we knew it in the 1970s may not have developed the way that it did. So it's interesting to look at what could have happened, but also what Young fostered in the things that he did. Another one of the very notable things that Young did before he died was he started negotiations with James Symes of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, this was the ultimate, probably the peak in rail consolidation until you got to the 1980s being Penn Central. This was, I'm going to speculate a little bit here. This was a little bit of a recognition by Young that the rail industry was in fact not going in the right direction. Now, to be clear, he waged the proxy fight of ages in order to take over the New York Central. And I mentioned this previously, and I think it's something that everybody should go back and look at. There's an article in the New Yorker, which we will link, which talks about the proxy fight. This was a full-on political campaign, almost right down to the people with the American flag draped hats and so on. And it was a true fight of, another reason I say it's political is because it was a true fight that we tend to look at populist versus establishment. The populist being Robert R. Young, who says, I am doing this because I want to stand up for the small shareholder. And you had more established forces, whether it was the Vanderbilt family, who still had a substantial involvement in the New York Central. You had a lot of their banking group, as we've talked about, J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley, which of course had been separated thanks to the Glass-Steagall Act by that time. And a lot of others who were involved in it who said, we'd like things to be status quo. What's interesting about the status quo folks, though, as Young would find out after he took over the New York Central, it was a financial shambles. A lot of things look good. You had the beautiful lightning stripes on the locomotives. You had trains like the 20th Century Limited running and so on. And so we as rail enthusiasts typically look at that as being the golden age of the New York Central. But it was a financially declining enterprise. And so it also makes me wonder why a lot of the people who were fighting to hold on to it wanted to at the time. But it's my belief that after he got there, he said, okay, we're going to have to do something different. The industry has even more structural problems than he was able to solve. And this is when he fell back on an old saw, which was consolidation. Now, the conversations with Symes went apparently very well, and this was the genesis of the Penn Central merger, but there was just one thing that happened, and that is Young killing himself after the New York Central missed a dividend payment. Now, I have not been able to find out much about his personality in my research. Now, the Borkin book does talk about it a little bit, and there are other articles out there that do discuss it. And we don't know if it was depression or if there was something else that was really driving him, or if it really was a just difficult time where he said, I tried hard. I can't succeed with this. I don't know what to do. It's the only way out. So, um, but but in doing that, it also scuttled the initial effort at the Penn Central merger. And with Symes and Young getting along very well, it's entirely possible the merger could have gone quite differently had it taken place with Young and Symes in charge. Now, to be clear, I think there would have been an absolute conflict between the two in terms of power sharing. Because after all, the Pennsylvania Railroad was a very proud, large, and established company. It had a lot of history behind it, and the people who led it were certainly not about to cede control of their enterprise to someone else. At the same time, Young was just as pugnacious. So, had the Penn Central merger taken place under those circumstances, we don't know what the battle for control would have looked like, and there may very well have been some of the elements that ended up taking place when Penn Central came about roughly 10 years later, where you had the Pennsylvania and the New York Central sides fighting each other. But what is clear is that Young's successor leading the Central, Al Pearlman, did not get along with Symes' successor in leading the Pennsylvania Railroad, Stuart Saunders. They were able to work together to get the merger through. They were not able to work together as leaders of the company. So it makes you wonder what might have been. Then there's also the question, had Young been able to do this with the relationships he had with people such as Cyrus Eaton, who followed him in leading the Chesapeake and Ohio, because he had to ultimately divest himself of the C&O in order to wage the proxy fight that was later successful at the New York Central the second time. Would those relationships have played into how some of the Pennsylvania's other rail assets, such as its control of the Wabash, its influence on the Wheeling and Lake Erie and the Pittsburgh and West Virginia, as well as the Norfolk and Western, would have played out? Could we have seen the N&W C&O merger take place that was rumored or that was planned, but a few years earlier as a result of Cyrus Eaton and Robert R. Young? We don't know. But they're certainly interesting things to look at, especially as railroading continues to be a discussion of arrangement of the various assets that the industry utilizes on a daily basis. And two more things I want to talk about. First of all, the FlexiVan. The FlexiVan was an innovation that is mostly credited to the New York Central during the time of Al Pearlman. And the FlexiVan was basically a container, just like the shipping containers we have now, that would be removed from its truck chassis and put onto a flat car. So at first blush, it sounds a lot like the double stack, except they weren't stacked two on top of each other. However, the FlexiVan was different because its chassis was specialized, and also because it had a special tractor, a truck, that had the equipment in order to move the FlexiVan without needing a crane. This was a type of innovation, although the FlexiVan itself did not end up becoming the standard for containerized freight. That was a spirit of innovation that Robert Young brought with him to the New York Central. Certainly, the New York Central at the end of the time of William White and Harold Vanderbilt, who ended up leaving the company as a result of Young's proxy fight, was not in the mode of innovating there and did not have the resources to do it. But much as we saw with Frank Lorenzo a few decades later, bringing that spirit of innovation and change to Continental Airlines and Eastern Airlines. And I know for those of you who are airline fans, you're probably wanting to kill me right now, but maybe we'll talk about that in another episode. But much as Lorenzo would bring that there and enable the changes that helped Continental to evolve and cope with the modern airline world, Young brought that to the New York Central, and the FlexiVan is one example. And by the way, the FlexiVan is not the only one, because at the Chesapeake and Ohio, another place where he brought that spirit and drive for innovation, you saw the early road railer concept, where the trailer itself was given railroad wheels, but at a crossing or other location was able, without a crane, to be removed from the railroad wheels and driven on the road like a regular trailer, tractor-trailer combo. So that gives you an idea of the sort of things that Young did, and a lot of that was able to help the rail industry as a whole as the doldrums of the 1970s receded. The Staggers Rail Act came along in 1980, and you started to see double stack freight. You started to see more trailer on flat car. You started to see a spirit and an approach that says, look, we have the ability to do a lot of these things that were talked about or tried on a small scale. Now we're going to do them, especially now that the capital is available and the regulatory structure makes sense. If there's one thing that I would like to see, aside from, of course, me running my own railroad, it would have been for Young to have survived and played out the 1960s in some form, leading either the New York Central or potentially the Penn Central. I think the industry could be dramatically different. I don't know if it would be good or bad, but as someone who looks at himself as an innovator and an entrepreneur, I believe that it could have been very good, and it's sad that we lost Young when we did. Now, quick programming note. Next Monday, we will not be on the air. We're going to take a one episode break, but we'll be back next Wednesday when we're going to talk about luxury trains, the American Orient Express, the American European Express, and the Rocky Mountaineer, some of the North American luxury trains, and some of the trains that led to its genesis. We will, however, be on the air this Thursday when we talk about Romance of the Rails, by former Cato scholar Randall O'Toole, and his very interesting take on railroading, transit, commuter rail, and land use, all of which I think you're going to find interesting, especially because O'Toole can oftentimes come off as somebody who is an absolute train hater, but you're going to find out some interesting things about him and his ideas when we talk about that. So please leave your thoughts in the comments, like, share, and subscribe, and we will be back with you tomorrow right here on the All Aboard Podcast. Have a great day, everyone.